do know that on our APAN website and also in the link shared in the chat box, you can read a lot more about these distinguished speakers that will be sharing here with us today. First up, we have Buena Bernal. She is CNA's correspondent based in the Philippines, who has worked for CNN International Asia Pacific, Al Jazeera in English, and many more. In her media career, she has focused on the underreported and has immersed herself in the daily lives of deep sea fishermen of sashimi-grade tuna, tobacco farmers, sugar plantation workers, and different tribes across the three main island groups of the Philippines. We have Buena Bernal, Philippines correspondent at Channel News Asia. Now, turning to Buena, I'd love to hear your thoughts as a journalist on how we can better tell the stories on women's experiences and leadership in climate-related technology sectors. And also, in your view, what influence can storytelling have on decision makers, and what are the key challenges or success factors for finding such stories?
Well, the power of storytelling is a given, but I do have to say as a caveat that the impact of stories exists only if these are stories that are told well, especially for stories about nature and elements of nature that do not have the ability to speak. So when you're telling stories about mitigation measures, adaptation technology, what you're doing is really bridging the gap between the climate policy bubble and the general public. These are jargon-heavy topics. And when you explain this to the general public, what you're doing is generating empathy for the natural world. And that takes nuanced storytelling. That involves going back to root causes, focusing on impact, adding the perspective of the disadvantaged. And strong storytelling means stories that have solid premises. This will appeal to your average reasonable person. So when you talk about solid premises on your reporting, you need baseline information, and data is crucial to that. We already discussed here how the effect of climate change varies vastly depending on your circumstances, whether you're in a rural or urban setting, or whatever factors you were born into. So disaggregated data, whether that is based on sex, age, disability, is important for these solid premises on our storytelling. But important as well to amplify women's voices and female leaders' voices is actual human experiences. So we need to showcase the full spectrum of how women are affected by climate change disproportionately. And that will make the audience understand that women leaders are best positioned to address these gaps. So, for example, we need to go out of our way to tell stories about how women are the ones fetching water during drought, how the lack of alternative power sources in rural areas that are off-grid would affect pregnant women about to go on labor, for example, or even more simply, this discussion on integrating climate change into the students' curriculum, how it's actually the women of the household, more often than not, assisting children in their remote learning right now. So good storytelling, solid premises, and integrating the perspective of the disadvantaged must be there. But more than any of that, in terms of success factors, I think the single most important success factor when you talk about climate change stories and women's stories in the media is newsroom management. One that is effective, sensitive as well, that understands the importance of stories about climate change. Reporters take the cue from editorial management. So, for example, when you have newsroom decisions like dedicating a climate change correspondent, or how newsroom has a dedicated section for climate change stories, or how a newsroom allocates time and resources for special reports about climate change and resilience, then you can see that the newsroom values this topic. So I think that's one important success factor there. But it'll also be helpful for civil society organizations and corporations, pitching stories to newsrooms to know that not only do reporters take their cue from editorial management, but the newsroom and the reporters are at the beck and call of news cycles. So that is just part of the job. So the question is, how do we make sure that even the chaos of one deadline after another, of chasing news in its traditional sense, and that is a recent event that matters to people, for example, the vaccination rollout in different countries, election, mass protests, that even in the middle of all these, and there's no shortage of such news events that we still report on stories that are not necessarily the major event of the week, but matters to humanity, such as climate change and women's issues. So, a personal example of this that I can point most recently is, for example, the unprecedented flooding that happened in the Philippines late last year. We saw unprecedented flooding in Cagayan Valley, that's north of Manila, late last year, and also flooding we haven't seen since 2009 in Marikina City in the eastern part of Metro Manila. And news crews were deployed to cover that event, right? So that was the news cycle of the week, maybe 2 weeks. But after that, news crews moved on to another news cycle. So it's easy to forget the issue. And what I decided to do was to not move on, basically, and to ask myself what was behind the flooding. And even weeks after the flooding, we did a special report on how the Philippines' denuded forests, or basically upstream areas such as river basins that are supposed to hold water, to hold flood water, were already denuded, and that caused that flooding in the downstream areas, and unfortunately, it claimed a lot of lives. So we went to the forest. We covered the area, and we saw a lot of remnants of charcoal making, for example. We saw how forest rangers were on confrontation with armed guards, for example, trying to encroach that protected area. But we also went downstream, and that is to talk to people affected, to the human experience of the flooding, because it'll be very hard to explain, the importance of the natural world upstream without looking at the impact. And this is where I met a mother named Jean Flores, who said that what the flooding did was really destroy all the equipment of her children for remote learning. So their laptop, their iPad, their cell phones were destroyed by the flooding, and that it would take 6 months of her husband's salary to recover what they lost. So allowing these types of special reports on forests, wetlands, wildlife, tributaries, even in the middle of what's hot and sensational at the moment, um, whatever is the news cycle of that week is really a function of effective and sensitive newsroom management. So to complement that, at the same time, showing how the damage to the natural capital affects women disproportionately is a crucial complement to newsroom management that the reporter or storyteller also brings to the table. So it's two sides of the coin.
Thank you so much, Buena. I really would like to thank you for your deep curiosity in going behind the news, because these are the stories that really matter, really looking at the interconnectedness of all things and understanding the real. Thank you so much, Soma. Buena, coming back to the importance of narratives and storytelling, we know that local stories in journalism can change narratives on how women are portrayed in the male-dominated technology sectors. So what is your role as a journalist, and what can other journalists learn from you about setting a good example of when a narrative has changed the gender norms in relation to climate change and renewable energy?
Well, from my experience, it's not really that single story that's changing gender norms or challenging gender norms. It's more of the women themselves, their stories. It's not my script per se. It's actually the subject. Let me give you examples of women leaders in this sector that I've recently interviewed. So I recently spoke with Dr. Teresa Mondita Lim, who is the executive director of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity. This wonderful woman in science, talking to me about the Dasgupta review, how our premium on growth has really caused us damage to our natural capital, and how this can be applied in ASEAN. And I was really struck by her premium on collaboration, how she highlighted the importance of collaboration among the ASEAN member states, saying that it's important for us to get a baseline assessment on the carrying capacity of the region, on how much development the protected areas of ASEAN can absorb. And this great woman in STEM was basically saying to me, we need more science. And I think this is a demonstrative trait of female leaders that I've seen their emphasis on collaboration. Um, they're more sensitive to a wide range of issues, and they're able to create these meaningful changes in their organization. So I think highlighting women like that with female leaders in the sector, uh, celebrating them is important because that opportunity that they have, what they're really doing is paving the way for other women to also be given that opportunity. Let me tell you more about other stories or women I've been inspired by in recent stories I did and I'm still doing right now. So the story on denuded forests, I told you about the impact on that on a mother downstream, but upstream actually, that conservation project here in the Philippines called the Masumi Geo Reserve is co-led by a woman named Ando Malyang, this small-built female leader who's also basically doing what the forest rangers are doing. You know, they're confronting these um, tall armed guards who are encroaching in the protected area in the Sierra Madre, which is a key biodiversity area here in the Philippines. So women are doing the work on the ground and they're providing solutions. You know, I've spoken with an architect, for example, who wants to go by the name Architect Joan, who's basically doing this alternative plan for a city north of Manila, um, so that that city can expand a major road without actually cutting down the trees, because the road expansion would cause 259 trees to be cut down. And she's doing this pro bono. They're leading the way, they're providing solutions, they're doing work on the ground. And I think it's really important um, to destroy this illusion um, of equality, basically, you know, that gender-based discrimination is a thing of the past. You know, maybe in some places there's no more outright discrimination, but there's still structural unconscious bias. And that's the reason why we highlight female leaders as well, because when we hear things like, well, I've done the same, you know, what's so impressive about her, what we're really seeing there is a lack of acknowledgement of the intersections of disadvantage and the multiple layers of suffering that other segments of society have gone through that maybe you haven't for whatever reason, you know, because of an inherent economic disadvantage or other factors you have no control over or were born into. So this idea of inclusive resilience, this brand of sensitivity to marginalized sectors, including women, the idea that they are paying the heaviest price for the ills in society, including climate change, is good for humanity, but also good for policymakers in particular. And I think storytelling is a tool to generate that kind of empathy to the natural world and also to women.
Thank you very much. I very much agree, because storytelling is what shifts hearts. As with all of our speakers today, I just feel like we need more time. I'm not sure about those of the rest of us who are watching in, but I'm deeply curious. I'm so deeply curious about. I want to dive deeper, but we just unfortunately don't have the time. So please do look them up online and go and follow them on their LinkedIn, on their social media, so that you can always learn more. Now we have a final cross-cutting question here, and this goes out to all of our speakers. What action is the most critical in order to scale up the existing experiences with digital technologies, storytelling, and amplifying women's voice and leadership? I'd like to go through the speakers here. We'll start with Buena, please.
Strong nuanced storytelling, placing women front and center of the human experience, is critical in mainstreaming women's work, in ensuring resilient communities, and critical in bridging the gap between the climate policy bubble and the general public. I believe that women's role as leaders in resilience building can be best articulated by the fact that it is the women in society who are disproportionately affected by climate change. So if we show that in our stories, it's easy for the audience to understand that women leaders are best positioned to address these gaps. And it's tempting to think there's no link between stories about women still in the margins and women who have quote unquote made it. But I think that it's an acknowledgement of the shared experience and long history of disadvantage. And the best way to communicate the need to empower women is to show those inherent disadvantages that other women still face. So we celebrate women because we know that their journey wasn't easy. And we celebrate equality in some respect because we know how unequal the world still is.
Thank you, Buena.